Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 247. This week the questions are taken from guides 298 and 299, so that's the Type 1936A or Narvik class destroyers and the carrier USS Ranger. The Wednesday videos supplying questions are SMS Seydlitz at Jutland and the US tour video on USS Salem. Alexei asks, which aircraft put more terror into the Arctic and Atlantic convoys, Heinkel He-111s or Ju-87 Stukas? For the Arctic and Atlantic convoys, that's definitely going to be the He-111 because, well, as you can see here, the He-111 could be configured as a torpedo bomber and could reach out that far. The Ju-87 Stuka, whilst quite a menace to convoys in the Mediterranean, as a single-engine dive bomber, didn't have the world's greatest range, so you don't really see Ju-87s operating against the Atlantic convoys. You do see them going after convoys in the Channel, and while Stukas did go after the Arctic convoys to a degree, so did the He-111s, but only He-111s of the two really went after any Atlantic convoys, and so simply by the fact of being the only bomber that went over both sets of convoys that you mentioned, the He-111 would be the winner. Martin Kolafa asks, are twin mounts generally heavier than two single mounts of the same gun? Unfortunately, there is no single correct answer, and as far as I can tell, there's not even really a trend, because when you have a given gun, whether that be, say, a 4-inch dual-purpose gun or a 4.5-inch from the Royal Navy or a 5-inch 38 from the US, the mountings can be quite different, so it can be difficult to compare. You saw probably with the Sims class, you can have an open 5-inch 38 single, a half-enclosed 5-inch 38 single, a enclosed but open-backed 5-inch 38 single, or a fully enclosed 5-inch 38 single, whereas all the twin 5-inch 38 mounts are fully enclosed, at least for the most part. So you have to compare like with like, because obviously a open-mounted 5-inch 38 single is going to weigh a lot less than an enclosed 5-inch 38 twin. But when you compare the enclosed 5-inch 38 singles with the 5-inch 38 twins, there are one or two cases where specific mount types are about double the weight, but most of the time a twin 5-inch 38 mount is considerably heavier than a single 5-inch 38 mount, assuming the enclosure mechanism is the same. But then when you look at the Royal Navy 4-inch, which you'll find on some of its earlier destroyers, and then as secondary batteries on cruisers, in the interwar period that is, you tend to find that in those cases, the twin mount is actually lighter, not absolutely, but it's lighter in relative terms compared to the single mount. The single mount, depending on which one you're looking at, is between 8 and 10 tons, and the twin mount is 15 tons. So you're actually getting more efficient with that. And then if you look at the 4.5-inch mount, the one that supersedes the 4-inch in the post-war environment, and the 4.7-inch for that matter, a single mount could be just over 11 tons or just over 15 tons, and the twin mounts could be anything from 30 tons to 50 tons and everything in between. So if you're using a Mark V mount, the single mount, which is an 11-ton mount, then all the twin mounts are heavier than that, whereas if you use the RP50 Mark V, then that being just over 15 tons comes in at just a little bit heavier per gun than the Mark III UD mount. And it goes back and forth like this across various guns. So on some guns, the equivalent twin mounting is lighter than two single mounts, and on others it's considerably heavier. It basically comes down to what changes are made going up to that twin mounting, because even if you have enclosed mounts on both the single and twin, which is ideally what you should be comparing, or open or semi-enclosed, whatever, but you should be comparing like with like, when you have the twin mountings, you will tend to see people putting in maybe things like fire control directors and range finders, or just thicker plating and things like that, which means that even if you have an enclosed single and an enclosed twin, the enclosed twin might be using heavier metal and thus come out overall somewhat heavier. Mordred25 asks, what was the average monthly pay of a sailor on Ranger in World War II? So this requires a little bit of retro calculation, because the pay grades that you might be familiar today in the US military, so in the case of the majority of the ship's crew, that's going to be enlisted, so E1 through E7, those grades didn't exist in World War II. Back then, you were enlisted, and then there was grades 1 through 7, but they didn't have the E numbers assigned to them, and they actually went in the opposite direction. So whereas these days in E1 is your lowest enlisted rank, in those days a 7th grade enlisted man was the lowest rank. So a 1st grade enlisted man, i.e. the equivalent of an E7 these days, which would be a chief petty officer, that would be the highest of the pay grades. So if we are assuming that the vast majority of Rangers crew are going to be standard seamen, so that would be E3 grade equivalent, that means 5th grade on the 1942 to 1946 pay chart. Your baseline pay, assuming you've been in service for less than 3 years, i.e. maybe start of the war, you're newly enlisted because the war's just kicked off, you get $66 a month. If you've been in for between 3 and 6 years, you get $69.30 a month. And if you're one of the longer serving sailors, then you'd get somewhere between $70 and $80 a month, depending on how many years of service you had. And obviously, as you move up the grades, the base grade for a 4th grade, which E4 equivalent would be these days a petty officer 3rd class, is $78 for less than 3 years, $81.90 a month for over 3 years, and it goes up to almost $90 if you've been in for the Navy for over 9 years and you are currently at that pay grade. But that is the base pay. So obviously, if you're on active frontline duty, there would be supplements, and there are other supplements of pay you can earn. But broadly speaking, for your average crewman aboard Ranger, you're probably looking at somewhere between, well, minimum $66 a month, possibly pushing up to upwards of $80 depending on your supplements and where you're stationed at the time. Deeks25 asks, did Ranger have to ensure her stacks were rotated before conducting flight ops? Did this impact her ability to respond to situations, or could combat air patrol fighters be spotted and launched well enough regardless of stack position? So we can see here Ranger undertaking flight ops with her stacks canted horizontally, which is the correct position for its flight ops. However, the rotation of the stacks was more to do with airflow behind the ship and decreasing the turbulence for incoming flights of aircraft, whether that be dive bombers or fighters, because remember, for most of her career, she couldn't operate torpedo bombers. Now, there is an additional advantage to canting the stacks out, as you can see here where she's marshalled a bunch of planes aft. The aircraft on the edges of the flight decks actually have their wings sticking out over the edge of the flight decks, which would be a collision risk with the stacks if the stacks weren't down. However, as you'll be most likely aware, back in World War II, fighters, particularly the combat air patrol, and to a certain extent even dive bombers, they don't need the full length of the flight deck to take off. You can see there's one getting ready to take off, and it's just forward of the bridge. Which means that if you absolutely need to get combat air patrol up and operational, where the stacks are positioned actually doesn't make too much odds. As long as you obviously keep the wings clear of the stacks whilst you're marshalling the aircraft further back, you can actually deploy aircraft from Ranger regardless of the stack position. It's more of a concern when you're bringing them back. Real MCB asks, Ranger had a movable funnel system, but did any other navies experiment with this funnel system? If so, which navies, what ships, and what was the evaluation of the system by said navies? No other navies implemented this kind of fully traversable funnel system on their fleet carriers. A few other navies, well, most other carrier operating navies for that matter, did actually try some other methods of deflecting funnel smoke away from the flight deck that didn't just involve a big stack immediately aft of the island. So Furious tried to direct all the funnel smoke aft by trunking it either side of the hangar within the hangar area and then kicking it all out the back, which was why Furious had less hangar capacity than Courageous and Glorious, amongst other things. The initial builds of Akagi and Kaga had big trunked funnels that trunked everything off to the side and down. This was something the Japanese fairly significantly experimented with. Bern had this big, basically cooling jacket system that tried to mix cool air with funnel exhaust before it was vented out the top. So there were lots of experiments, and those are just some of them, but nobody put a carrier into service quite like Ranger with these side-mounted 90-degree swiveling funnels. There were a few experiments with test ships and test rigs by other navies that looked into it, but they don't seem to have gotten very far into the testing, and as a result, what's left in terms of experimental notes and data tends to be a few sketches and kind of, we thought about this, and sometimes not even clear if they just thought about it and decided it was a bad idea, or if they thought about it and actually tested it before deciding it was a bad idea. But it never, as I said, never entered service with anybody else. Riverine Plunder asks, why was British gunnery so bad in World War I? Well, the simple answer is that it wasn't actually that bad. At the Battle of the Falkland Islands, the battle cruisers had about a 6% hit rate, and at the Battle of Dogger Bank, they also had around about a 6 to 6.5% hit rate, albeit that is somewhat skewed by the ridiculous number of hits that were scored on Blucher when she was basically stationary and unable to fire back. Now, comparatively, German gunnery at Dogger Bank was about 2.5%, which is probably closer to what is actually going on, because if you adjust out Blucher's hits while she's stationary, then the battlecruiser fleet's gunnery drops down to about 1.5%, which is worse than the Germans, admittedly, but then you go through to Jutland, and so where you've got the high of about 6% for battlecruisers at the Battle of Falkland Islands, the low for the British of about 1.5% on moving targets at Dogger Bank, and then you look at the breakdown of accuracy at Jutland between the two sides. The lowest accuracy is the first and second battlecruiser squadrons, i.e. the battlecruiser fleet, i.e. BT ships. They expend a huge number of shells, and they only get about 1.43, 1.5% accuracy, so actually not much changed from Dogger Bank. And then as you go up the line, you get 5th Battle Squadron, which has about 2.6% accuracy, so they have slightly better accuracy in 5th Battle Squadron than the 1st Scouting Group has at the Battle of Dogger Bank. Now, that might be a surprise because 5th Battle Squadron has a reputation at Jutland for very good gunnery, but again, this is one of the problems with gunnery analysis. That's all of the 5th Battle Squadron, the shells fired, compared to all of the hits they scored. So 5th Battle Squadron, as well as having an issue with their spreads actually being too close together, ironically enough, they also hit quite hard during their initial appearance, but then you've also got later on when they're fighting off the High Seas Fleet, and then later on when they're at the tail end of the British line, and then some of the night action, which drops their overall accuracy. But anyway, then moving up the line, the next least accurate, or actually specifically middle of the road accuracy really, is actually the German battleships with 2.96% gunnery accuracy. Then you have the British Grand Fleet, which has a significantly better 3.7% gunnery accuracy score. Then just a fraction above the body of the Grand Fleet, and bear in mind again they have a lot of shells being fired at night, you have First Scouting Group with 3.89%, so they've got 0.19% better accuracy than the Grand Fleet. And then King of the Hill, in terms of gunnery accuracy, is 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron with 4.39%. And then, of course, you can take individual ships like Iron Duke with 14% gunnery accuracy. So, in actual fact, at Jutland, 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, which is British, has the best accuracy of all of them. The British Grand Fleet is significantly more accurate than the German battle fleet, but the German battle cruisers are more accurate than the British battle cruisers, except for 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, and so on and so forth. So, and when you apply this across the few other engagements where there's major capital ships involved on both sides, British gunnery isn't actually that bad. It's in World War One. British gunnery in the battle cruiser fleet is pretty bad, but anybody who spends any significant amount of time at Scapa Flow tends to actually have very good gunnery. Damian Perowski asks, how loud on average were the main guns of the Seydlitz, and how much would it have in respect of the gun crew have been dampened by the armoured steel of the turret? What kind of hearing protection would they have to use? It's a very difficult question to answer, unfortunately, because if you remember the pressure wave chart that I posted a little while ago in another question, which shows the pressure waves for a 16-inch 50 caliber gun firing from Iowa, that pressure profile is pretty much universal for all naval guns. It's just slightly different intensities. And so where exactly you're measuring it is going to make a huge difference. If you're measuring right in front of the gun muzzle, it's going to be incredibly loud. I've seen some figures of over 180 decibels for that. Whereas if you've stuck a microphone to the side of the gun, then it might measure considerably lower. If you stick a microphone on top of the turret, so directly behind the gun, it's going to be considerably lower still. And then, of course, you have to bear in mind where is the turret pointing. So in this example, for instance, you can see this is Seydlitz from above. If you were standing on the port side, to the just about level with the starboard amidships turret, then the sound experience you're going to get there, where you're behind the nearest turret and to the side of the port side wing turret and the fore turret, is going to be considerably less than, say, if you're standing just to the starboard of the funnel, where you're basically going to be directly in line with the blasts of the two wing-mounted guns and forward, actually, of the forward turret, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, this is why you see figures for battleship gun broadsides that range anything from 140 decibels all the way up to 210 decibels and everything in between. But the steel of the turrets does have a fair amount of damping effect on that, but you still do have to wear hearing protection. The most common hearing protection for people in World War One tended to be raw cotton wool and just stuffed into the ears. There were some slightly more professional grade hearing protection systems available, but by and large people just used stuff like cotton wool because it dampened it enough for their purposes. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if Seydlitz is the German version of Warspite and Enterprise, i.e. a ship that's too stubborn to die, who are the Japanese and Italian versions of Warspite and Enterprise? For the Japanese, it's a bit more difficult to quantify because with Seydlitz, Warspite and Enterprise obviously all being capital ships, they not only take a pounding, but they survive. For the Japanese, you can point to a number of their ships, whether they be carriers or battleships, that took quite a pounding, but in the end, most of them were sunk. So there's precious few to actually choose from when it comes to Japan, and the ones that didn't get sunk tended not to be the ones that were repeatedly hit a lot. But for the Italians, whilst they're not in World War II long enough to rack up significant amounts of damage repair, and obviously you don't have something like World War One major capital ship engagements for the Italians, which is where you get things like Seydlitz or half of Warspite's legend. I think if I was going to pick any Italian capital ship that took a real hit that should, on balance, maybe have resulted in significantly worse things happening to it, but still managed to survive, you'd probably have to go with Vittorio Veneto, because, sorry, that's Floppy, the dog in the background. Vittorio Veneto, as you can see here, this is what her stern looked like after she got torpedoed by a Royal Navy torpedo bomber. And yeah, that's not good. Yes, that is a propeller shaft you can see over there to the left, and that's another propeller shaft you can see that's had a nice big chunk blown into its run in the middle. Now, this kind of hit would be the kind that eventually doomed Prince of Wales and Bismarck. and for a while it looked like Vittorio Veneto was probably going to go the same way. However, Vittorio Veneto's rudders weren't quite as badly mangled as Bismarck's, and whilst the damage to her prop shaft, as you can see, was probably, if they restarted it, about as fatal as that occurred to Prince of Wales, the difference with Vittorio Veneto was that because she wasn't under continued sustained attack after that torpedo hit, she was able to slow down, the engineers were able to take stock, take measure, and then work to get the non-completely buckled propeller shafts up and operational, and she gradually managed to pull away. So, if you want to put it in anthropomorphic terms, if you imagine the hit to Prince of Wales, which is probably more accurate than the one on Bismarck, because Prince of Wales and Vittorio Veneto are both hit on propellers shafts rather than Bismarck, which is more to do with a rudder. Prince of Wales is basically shot in the back of the knee, but then because the people are still chasing after her, has to basically get up, try and limp away, compounds the damage and collapses. Vittorio Veneto is also kneecapped, but manages, because she's not being immediately pursued at close range, to kind of lie on the ground, take a moment, scream a little bit, then find a stick, get herself back upright and limp away. Mark Arellano asks, have you ever listened to the band The Dreadnoughts? They've recorded many sea shanties and other naval-themed content, if nothing else, Lifeboat Man and Peak La Balena, I think. Up until this question, no, I hadn't listened to them. I had a quick listen to some of the stuff they've got up on YouTube, and I had a quick look through their band listing. And, I mean, from the 2 recommended tracks that you had and a couple of others I listened to, they're a reasonably good band from an objective point of view. It's just that their particular musical genre doesn't tend to be the same kind of musical genre that I prefer. And that's not to say they're a bad band. Within the scope of their musical type, they're actually, I think, pretty good. In as much as, well, as I say, I'm not a particularly big fan of that particular music genre. But if someone put a CD, or I know that's showing my age, but if someone put an album of theirs on, I'd perfectly be willing to listen to it. Which is a lot more than I can say for a lot of other sort of folk punk style bands. So yeah, now I've taken a bit of a listen there, and I'd say they're pretty good. Reverend Howell asks, when Salem's auto 8-inch only need humans once, that isn't necessarily 1 human per gun, or 3 humans actually moving projectiles per turret, is it? No, as you can see, this down here is in the shell room of Salem, one of the turrets, one of the barbettes to be more precise. And when I mentioned in the video that your humans are only needed once in context of humans have to put shells and charges into the hoists, and then the hoists take the shells and charges up to the guns, where they're then loaded and fired. Obviously there's humans involved in telling the guns where to point and fire, but it's down here that the humans are actually needed. So obviously, yeah, you're not just going to have 1 human or 3 people, 1 per gun. You're going, well, at minimum, you need a couple of people to manhandle the 8-inch shells and a couple of people to deal with the charges per gun. So that's a minimum of 6, but in actual fact, there's a lot more because, you don't want to run the entire thing on a minimum skeleton staff. But essentially, it means that there's this single point of interface, which is putting the ammunition into the hoists to get everything going. And for that, you might need several dozen men to keep up with the demands of the rate of fire that Salem's guns can actually sustain, but they only need to be in 1, broadly speaking, location, i.e. the shell rooms and magazines. Which are, yes, technically speaking, 2 locations, but for overall purposes, you get the idea. Beardy Hobbs asks, I often hear the Bismarck referred to as the most powerful battleship in the world. What was it that put it ahead of the Queen Elizabeth's, Colorado's, Nagatos, Nelson's and Richelieu's? Well, the simple answer is that Bismarck isn't the most powerful battleship in the world. Some of it comes from Allied propaganda, as I said before. Some of it just comes from the fact that as far as things that everybody agrees were as a battleship, she was the biggest battleship in terms of displacement at the time that she was launched, and some people equate size to power. pretty much any treaty-era battleship, whether that's Richelieu, King George V, North Carolina, etc., can give her a pretty fair fight, and a number of the treaty-era battleships are probably actually superior to her. I've said before, if the shell issues were fixed, I'd take a Littorio over Bismarck. I'd also rate Richelieu's chances. If Richelieu and Bismarck are both fully fitted out facing off against each other, I'd give Richelieu a fairly decent fighting chance of being superior to Bismarck. And then, King George V is an approximately equal match. North Carolina has a slight edge in firepower. Okay, its armour isn't spectacular, but that's life. And the South Dakotas, they have the armour and the firepower to go toe-to-toe with Bismarck quite happily. The thing that Bismarck really has, apart from just being outlandishly large for what she brings to the table, is a little bit of a speed advantage over most, but not all, treaty-era capital ships. And I suppose that there is one circumstance where you might be able to argue that Bismarck is the most powerful battleship in the world, and that's purely because she commissions slightly ahead of everybody else's treaty-era battleships. So Bismarck commissions in early to mid-1940. King George V is a few months later. North Carolina is a few months after that. Richelieu, as we know, was still not quite ready for action when France fell, and so on and so forth. So for a few months, when she's the only treaty-era battleship, or full-size treaty-era battleship that's operational, because of course you have Dunkirk and Strasbourg, then during that period, she's probably the most powerful battleship in the world. But that is still an arguable thing, because you'd be combining speed, protection, and firepower for that, particularly Bismarck getting a lot of points because of her speed, whereas if you look at look at the ships that you've listed. So the Queen Elizabeths, their guns aren't quite as powerful, and they are slower, but they're World War I era ships, so c'est la vie. The Colorados have the same number of guns, but bigger guns, 16-inch versus 15-inch, although Bismarck has high-velocity guns, and Bismarck is faster than the Colorados. So Colorado can hit a little bit harder at reasonable gun ranges, and actually has thicker armour, but Bismarck can outpace Colorado quite easily, dictate the range of the engagements, and that's before you get into arguments that go back and forth over the internet as to whether or not Bismarck's armour scheme was, according to some people, the best thing since sliced bread, according to other people, completely useless, and according to everyone else, somewhere in between. The Nagatos are a bit closer to Bismarck in speed, but still Bismarck has a huge speed advantage. Again, 8 16-inch guns, but by any metric, the Nagatos are less well protected than Bismarck. The Nelsons arguably have, they have thicker and better laid out, in my opinion, armour than the Bismarcks, although again that's an armour effectiveness debate. They've got more and bigger guns, but they are considerably slower. And Richelieu, as I said, if I was going to go in and fight Richelieu versus Bismarck, once they've both been completed, I'd probably actually just about be putting my money on Richelieu, but that's me. And so that's basically the summary of it. Once the other treaty-era battleships start to come into service, Bismarck is just one of many. And then you've got arguments of Bismarck versus Hood. Obviously, that's in one version of things. That's solved by the Battle of Denmark Strait. But as I've gone over in my video as to why Hood ended up being sunk, the matchup between Hood and Bismarck is actually much closer on paper than you might otherwise think, even though obviously Hood is at a slight disadvantage, and Denmark Strait a rather major one. Bismarck's not the most powerful battleship in the world total, possibly the most powerful battleship in the world circa summer 1940, by some metrics, although she'd probably still lose in a straight-up fight against some of the Washington Treaty-era ships, and indeed Rodney did kind of get the better of her. But once those other ships start to come into commission, she's definitely not the most powerful ship in the world at all.
HMS Inconceivable asks, you previously mentioned that naval gun turrets had to be assembled at the ship. How were 15-inch guns and turrets for HMS Vanguard stored in that case? Were they completely disassembled down to their component parts and armour plates? Gun turrets could be stored in a number of ways. You can see here the turrets that would eventually go on Vanguard being refitted out prior to installation. And as you can see, some of them are at this stage in their refitting process essentially feature complete, and the one closest to us has its roof taken off so they can continue working on it. Now, there are pros and cons to storing turrets like this. Obviously, this isn't storage, this is basically during remanufacturing. But if you were to store a turret completely in this state, with the gun barrels installed and the roof on and everything, it takes up the minimum amount of space. However, there is a chance that with the sheer weight of the guns acting on the mechanisms that are holding it in place, you might end up with something freezing up. Whereas if you store the guns and the turrets separately, obviously you take the roof off, take the guns out, and then put the roof back on, that's probably best long-term for the preservation of both gun and turret, but it does mean you need a bit more storage space, and you have to take two separate sets of preservation measures. And then, of course, there's the fact that even once you've reconditioned, in this case, the gun turrets, and you've got them all up to spec, they can't go out to the ship like this. They're far too complex, they're actually far too easily broken, and also they will weigh far, far too much to easily get back out to Vanguard. So then we switch over to this photo, bearing in mind how complete we saw those turrets when they were in the factory. And this is Vanguard in the process of fitting out, and as you can see, they've essentially near enough, it makes no difference, dismantled the entire thing, and are now in the process of popping it all back together again on the ship. So you've got essentially the base plate in there. Looks like the hoists are mostly in, the cradles are in, and of course the front armour plate is in, but the side armour, the back of the turret, the roof, and so forth, none of those are installed at this stage. So essentially at various stages between being taken off of their original ships, in this case, and then being put back into operation aboard Vanguard, these turrets were actually reassembled, disassembled, and reassembled again multiple times, and at various points they would have been in storage in various states of assemblage. A Salty Potato asks, do you think that arming the Brooklyns with 15 guns was a mistake, given that they were designed as such to match the Mogamis, which broke the treaty limits, whilst the US was trying to keep to them? Would it have been better if the US Navy had instead made them more into what would eventually be called the Clevelands? It's fairly easy to look back now and go, yeah, well, look at that wonderfully long hull, and, you know, how many additional 5-inch gun mounts or 40mm guns could you have fitted if you hadn't had that third forward turret? But you do have to remember a few things. Firstly, when the Brooklyns were designed back at the beginning of the 1930s, the air threat was nothing like what it was going to become. And for all Billy Mitchell's ramblings about things, Billy Mitchell, as I'll point out in a video that I'll do at some point in the future, is what I like to call fractally wrong. You know, almost everything he said was actually wrong, but in the most general terms, the events that he thought were happening in the 1920s came about in the 1940s. But in any case, the point is that when you come to designing the Brooklyns, the notional anti-aircraft armament they're supposed to have is probably fine for the threat they think they're going to face. And there's also the fact that the 6-inch guns and turrets that they were fitted with, notionally, at least at the time, they thought might have some kind of anti-aircraft role. You know, you don't put a main battery turret with a 60-degree elevation for nothing. At which stage, well, that's 15 ultra-heavy long-range anti-aircraft guns. And then you take into account their actual main mission profile, which was surface engagements, and, well, 15 guns is quite a lot. They're looking for an overwhelming rate of fire, especially since this is the first generation of full-size 10,000-ton 6-inch cruisers, so you want every single advantage you can possibly get, not only to overwhelm your regular opponents, but also potentially to try and overwhelm 8-inch gun cruisers, which otherwise might finish you off. And considering that most people thought that 8 guns was the minimum price of entry, and some 8-inch cruisers were out there with 10 guns, then, well, having 12 6-inch guns might not seem like enough of a margin. Having 15, on the other hand, definitely would seem like enough of a margin. So, whilst, yes, in theory, in absolute retrospect, not having one of the 666s and sticking more 5-inch and initially more 1.1-inch and then later 40mm on might have been an absolutely better idea. In relative terms, and certainly in terms of when they were designed, there's nothing at that point to tell them not why they should do that and why the 15 6-inch gun isn't the ideal. Sapper Ninja asks, I recently read an article that stated that Bismarck's 3-rudder layout was not a weakness and did not overly affect the outcome of Operation Rhein, as most contemporary battleships also struggled to steer with just screws. Could any of the other modern fast battleships have overcome a stuck hard over rudder with differential propulsion? I think I know the article that you're talking about. I'd kind of disagree with it for a number of reasons. So we're looking at Bismarck's stern in this picture. Whilst it is correct to say that most contemporary battleships struggle to steer with just screws, there's 2 things. One is there's relative degrees of struggle, and second is it's not just about whether or not a ship can steer with a jammed rudder using only its screws. Because, okay, yeah, fair enough. If another capital ship had a rudder jammed hard over, and pretty much any ship would have struggled to make straight line headway with that, regardless of whether it has 2, 3, or 4 screws. However, there are a few other factors taken into account. Now, as I say, this is Bismarck's stern, and you probably can tell from this, but if not, let's go and look at it from a slightly more side-on view. The triple screw design has a couple of big issues when it comes to the whole scenario. Firstly, as you can see, the port and starboard screws, in this view you can see the center and starboard screw, but obviously the port one is symmetrical to it. They are quite close to the central screw and also quite close to the rudder. Now, what this means, if you're familiar with the story of Bismarck, is that one of the things they considered was blowing the stuck rudder off using divers and explosive charges, but this ran into 2 problems. Firstly, a general problem with the triple screw layer, as you can see where the central screw is, the hull has to come up quite far forward on the ship, which creates a somewhat weak stern area to accommodate the centrally rotating propeller blade. That makes the stern itself more vulnerable to underwater explosions, even intentionally set ones, and it also specifically means that if you blow one or both rudders off, depending on if one of the rudders was even still attached immediately afterwards, you also have the problem that that blast may damage one or more of your propellers. Now, we know from the wreck that the central propeller was already damaged by being hit by the rudder whilst it was turning, but they were worried that the blast, if they again knocked off the offending rudders, might damage the ship's propulsion and leave the whole thing dead in the water, which would be a problem. Now, you compare that to some 4-bladed designs, or 4 propeller shaft designs, I should say, sorry, and there's a few different issues in place. So one of the more unusual ones, the South Dakota class, you can see here represented by USS Massachusetts, with outboard skegs. Now, in this case, the propellers are also quite close to the rudder, so blowing off the rudder might have some serious implications, but the hull is significantly, as you can probably tell comparing the first photo to this one, is significantly chunkier in the stern, so it's at less risk of the explosions themselves. Plus, if there's any ship that's likely to be able to make steerage using just its propellers, a South Dakota class is probably a fairly good bet. You can see how far apart those outer propellers are. It's not going to be easy at all, but they have the best chance. And then we come over to the other four shaft designs, or some of them. And once again, you can see the fuller hull, and this will be a consistent feature, so I'll stop mentioning now. But this is the underwater profile of USS Missouri, of course, an Iowa-class battleship. And you can see here that her outboard propellers are set much further back than relative to the inboard propellers than Bismarck's outboard propellers are relative to her central propeller. And of course the Iowas, as you can see, they're having twin rudders. The Richelieus, which Richelieu itself is seen here, single rudder. And again, you can see in this case, the starboard side propellers. And in this case, you can see again, outboard propeller set quite far back, and in fact, very far back from the rudder. And then we move over to King George V's. And again, you can see how far back the propeller shafts are set. Again, starboard view, but there's the starboard outer and then the starboard inner, and then the rudder is kind of off screen to the bottom left. So what does all this mean? Well, what this means is, apart from, again, this, of course, you can tell from the top left is Duke of York specifically. But anyway, what it means is that if you have a jammed rudder on a 4-shaft warship, unless it happens to be a South Dakota class, but in pretty much all the other cases, yes, you're probably not going to make steerage very easily, if at all. But if you do decide, okay, well, this is done, we're going to blow the stuck rudder off, whether that be one of 2 rudders or just a single rudder, and just try and make our way that way, then 1, your stern is more likely to take the blast, and 2, if you're worried potentially about the effects of the blast damaging propellers and being more of a problem, this is less of an issue with most 4-shaft designs, because whilst there is a somewhat risk that you might damage the inboard shafts, you'd have to really, 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 really overdo it with the explosives for a demolition charge that's designed to blow off the rudder to reach so far forward on the hull that it's going to significantly impair the ability of your outboard shafts, which, again, apart from the South Dakota design, are much, much further forward than they are in Bismarck. And I hope you can see the relative values going back now to the view of Bismarck's stern. So coming all the way back around to the original question, was Bismarck's triple screw layout a weakness? Inasmuch as any capital ship would struggle to steer on propellers alone, that much, maybe not quite as much, but still the Bismarck design would struggle more than most because of its outer propellers being somewhat closer to the centerline than on a 4-screw design, but that's a relative factor. The bigger issue, I think, in engineering terms is that partly because of the induced weakness of the hull caused by the triple screw layout and partly because of the blade arrangement incurred by the triple screw layout, it meant that by dint of having it, when this problem occurred, Bismarck had fewer options to exercise, whereas a 4-shaft layout could risk things that Bismarck couldn't, which would, at the very worst case, leave you with a 2-shaft ship, but with your 2 outermost shafts, i.e. the shafts that, if you're going to get any steerage at all, they're the ones that are going to give you some degree of steerage. So overall, I'd say, yeah, Bismarck's triple screw layout was a weakness, just not necessarily a direct one in the way that most people would immediately think. Roadrunner Meat Meat asks, just how inaccurate is the 2005 movie Sahara? While I love the movie, I find it impossible to believe a Civil War ironclad can make it to Mali via the Niger River even in a flood, or get the cannon and shell to work. Well, we're fortunately given the name of the ironclad in the book, the CSS Texas, which, as you can see here, was actually designed and was part of a run of 3 ironclads in total, including the Texas. Now, the idea of her getting up the Niger River is in and of itself not entirely implausible. She's a monitor, so she's designed to operate in rivers anyway. However, she does draw up just over 13 feet of water when fully loaded. And getting up the Niger River through now what's Nigeria is one thing. Getting further beyond that, certainly getting up into Mali, which is where the book and the movie have her fetch up, that's quite another, because you run out of even seasonably navigable Niger River before you run out of Nigeria. And at 13.5 foot, Texas draws somewhat more water than a number of other ironclads. Now, Okay, it's specified that it's, really bad flood stage that she makes her way up there. And to be fair, as a lot of rivers, but especially some of the big African rivers like the Nile and the Niger, really do go all out when they get into serious flood stages. So it's notionally plausible that perhaps a ship that's drawing about 13 feet might make it up to Mali if you were in a kind of 1 in 1,000 year flood event. But you've also got to remember that that's when the ship is fully loaded, given that it's apparently arrived off of the coast of West Africa, having sailed somehow from the east coast of America and survived that journey. She's going to be, I suppose, fairly low on fuel, fairly low on food, probably fairly low on drinking water, although she's in a freshwater river, so maybe that's not so much of a concern. We're going to assume that maybe she expended a good chunk of her ammunition during the fight to get past the Union blockade. And then maybe if in their attempt to forge all the way up the river, maybe they dumped some of the guns. Obviously in the film they use one of the guns, so they kind of dumped all of them. But they may have dropped one or two of the bits of armament. Perhaps the armor wasn't fitted or wasn't entirely fitted, or maybe they took it off. So, there are a variety of ways by which the ship might not have been drawing 13 foot. She might have been drawing 12, 11, 10 foot, something like that. Even so, it's a fair stretch to get all the way up to Mali. You could write, and I suppose Clive Cussler did write, some kind of exceptional circumstances where this would be possible. But in ordinary circumstances, she could have reached fairly deep into Africa, but she wouldn't have reached as far as she does in the book or the film. Now, as far as getting the cannon and shell to work, you'd be surprised at weirdly how durable these things can be. In a hot, dry environment with theoretically relatively minimal amounts of moisture, I could believe that something like a Civil War era smoothbore that's subject to relatively minimal rusting might be in a fireable condition, as long as you don't mind taking your life into your own hands. The bigger problem is going to be the ammunition itself. A shell is a shell is a shell. It's just a projectile. But after, 140 to 150 years, even in the sand, I'm not sure I'd trust the gunpowder. It will have degraded, and whether that's degraded into becoming more sensitive or just degraded into becoming completely inert, it depends on the mix, depends on the exact environmental conditions. So, yeah. If you had fresh powder, and as a result you'd also freshly loaded the shell, again, I can see a marginal case for saying maybe you could get the cannon to work, although it would still be a colossal risk, and I personally wouldn't want to be within 100 feet of the thing. But if you're using period powder and period charges with a presumably somewhat rusted up cannon, I'm afraid I don't think that's really going to do anything more than, if you're lucky, create a fizzle. If you're unlucky, create a pipe bomb. Tom asks, I've always wondered about the nature and service record of sea service Royal Marines in the First and Second World War. So for sea service, as opposed to the Royal Marine Brigades, Land Brigades, Royal Marine Divisions, etc., the Marines provided their usual shipboard security role. They also manned at least one aft turret on the bigger ships, on battleships and so forth, whether that was Q, X, or Y, or on some occasions X and Y, depended ship by ship. But those were the extent of their duties for the most part, unless, of course, the sea service element transferred to land service. But since you asked about sea service specifically, they would also take part in small landings, usually fairly rapid ones, or they'd be the advanced party in a larger landing, or scout preparatory landings. General operations where ships found themselves in a position where they needed somebody to go on land and inspect things or fight things or shoot things or blow things up. But the sea service particular Marines, i.e. the ones assigned to specific warships, wouldn't generally be assigned to larger landings in large numbers in kind of enforce the way perhaps might have happened in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And they wouldn't stay ashore for too long, usually either, unless, of course, again, they were reassigned to a marine unit that was more configured for fighting on land than providing their regular duties at sea. Graham William Kidd asks, what were the main features of the small boat wars in the waters around the UK in World War II? What were the goals of both sides? What were the main boats and weapons? And what were the major similarities and differences between the two sides? What nations' personnel and material were involved in addition to Germany and the UK? And was there a bit of independence with crews modifying their boats? Well, the main goals of the German boats, which the Allied call E-boats, the Germans call S-boats or Schnellboote, which they're basically torpedo boats. This is going to be a very high-level overview for obvious reasons. You could do a whole series of Wednesday videos on this particular conflict or element of World War II. But the main objective of the German boats was to try and interdict convoys, sink anything they could get their hands on, whether that be a merchant ship or a warship, lay mines, and also make sure that certain areas were clear for the passage of either blockade runners, Hilfskreuzer, or U-boats, depending on the time period. The main Allied objective, of course, was to stop all of this happening and ideally sink as many E-boats as they could. And if they could suppress the E-boats, then they would try and return the favour, but there was generally a lot less coastal traffic in occupied Europe and Germany than there was over in the UK for, I would hope, are fairly obvious reasons. Now, the main boats and weapons that everybody had, well, the Germans, everyone had various subclasses, but broadly speaking, the German S-boats were the fastest. They're usually around just over 100 foot long, you usually weigh just over 100 tons, and they were very, very quick, assuming circumstances were favourable. However, they also tended to be the lightest armed, usually carrying 37mm and 20mm cannon. The British MTBs, the motor torpedo boats, most of them were somewhat smaller than the S-boats, but tended to be about the same or slightly heavier in armament. A lot of MTBs, especially by the mid part of the war, would be carrying a 6-pounder, which was something that most German E-boats didn't have a direct answer to, but we'll come on to modifications a bit later on. And then the largest, but also slowest, tended to be the British motor gunboats, a lot of them being Fairmile C and Fairmile D types. And they had huge armaments for the small craft battles. You can see this one here. This one is a Canadian. Although it's labelled on the side, you can see MTB 727. By the time you get to this stage, certainly Fairmile Ds could be built as torpedo gunboats or motor gunboats. And in this case, you can see it's an MTB. There's a torpedo launcher directly above the lettering. But you could easily take those torpedoes off and stick a couple more guns on it. And as you can see, it's not exactly short of guns as it is. Generally speaking, the Allies would have an advantage with radar and with signal intercepts. Radar, for a lot of the war, didn't get small enough to get down to levels that could be installed on boats like this, although towards the end of the war there were some units. And so it was very dissimilar. Effectively, you had kind of easily 40 plus knot E-boats, then kind of high 30s, low 40s MTBs that had the firepower to duke it out with the E-boats or S-boats, but basically less hull to absorb the damage. And then the MGBs, who could basically take on anybody in a fight, but they had to catch people first, and they were usually capable of less than 30 knots, although, again, some were a bit quicker. Now, specifically in the Channel, there were also some PT boats. A number of PT boat squadrons were assigned to the UK south coast, and they took part in this conflict as well. But generally speaking, most of the tactics, in part because of the speed difference, in part because also the Germans were generally a little bit more on the offensive, combined with the intelligence advantages that the British had, would generally be for British or Canadian or maybe occasionally the US boats to try and lie in wait, either in a patrol line or with engines switched off, because they tended to know roughly where the E-boats were likely to be going, and if they didn't, well, there was relatively little chance of catching them, because, as I said, the Germans had the speed advantage. And because the Germans tended to have usually slightly fewer E-boats around, or S-boats, I use the terms interchangeably because the Allies call them E-boats, the Germans call them S-boats. And also, they tended to be, carrying things like reasonably large numbers of torpedoes for their size, or mines, which tended to react very badly to being shot. On average, a German flotilla commander, if he ran into opposition from MTBs, MGBs, or PT boats, would tend to just try and run, because his objective wasn't to fight a small boat war. His objective was normally to hunt something bigger. But, of course, sometimes that couldn't be avoided, and sometimes they just did want to get stuck in. And that's where crew modification comes in. So, yes, there were some standard gun fits to all types of boats we've mentioned, but there was quite a wide variety and latitude in armament, especially as war progressed. So you had some German commanders went for the lots of guns approach. A few of them put flak Vierling 20mm on their boats. Others went for the heavy-duty stuff. There's at least one E-boat or S-boat out there that's known to have installed something in the order of I think it was either an 86 or 88mm flak cannon, which was that was certainly a thing. And exactly what you'd find, whether you'd find Vickers guns, Lewis guns, Orlikans, Hispanos, Bofors, pom-poms, 3-inch, 4-inch, 6-pounders, 12-pounders, etc. on MTBs and MGBs, was generally down to what's available in port at the time, and or what creative bargains and or larceny have the crew been getting up to in the last few months. Bob Fry asks, I've been looking at the Royal Navy battle class and the USN Sumners with regards to their main armament. Setting aside the difference in size between 4.5 and 5-inch, I'm curious about turret layout. I think I understand the gun mounts on the Tribal class with open back turrets and simpler ammunition handling allowed loading from the right side for the right gun and left for the left gun. The battles with the Mark IV turret seem to have much more room in the turret versus the 5-inch 38s on the Sumners. Is this because the ammunition handling requires more space versus the centre lifts on the Sumners? Did they retain the close side-by-side spacing of the guns to save on engineering and development time? And do you see any sizable advantage to either layout? Now, I can't necessarily help you immediately, because the battles actually have two different gun mounts. So you can see here, these are the earlier battles with the BD Mark IV mount, the between deck mount, and then the later battles, and then obviously the Darings as well, have the UD Mark VI, the upper deck or upon deck Mark VI mount, which is much more boxy. So if you could message me and let me know which of the two mountings you are interested in, and hopefully you mean the UD Mark VI, because then at the time that this goes out, I will be a few weeks away from going to Australia, and obviously having been inside quite a number of 5-inch 38 turrets, I will then hopefully be able to get inside a 4.5-inch UD Mark VI mount on HMAS Vampire, and then I'll be able to tell you everything about it with lots of pictures. So hopefully that's okay, but if you can please let me know that you are happy with me to compare and contrast a 5-inch 38 mounting with a UD Mark VI mounting for the 4.5-inch twins, and I'll get right on it. And that brings us to the end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Just one important announcement to make. In 3 weeks, as of the time that this video goes live, I shall be heading out for Australia to look at what is a surprisingly vast array of naval history that has been preserved there, including some one-offs, i.e. the only preserved versions of certain naval ships. And this is the first trip that I have tried to crowdfund. So the Canada crew, if you've seen my trip to Canada, so Dr. Alexander Clark, Gareth and Dan Friedman, we are all heading out to Australia. But Australia is a lot more expensive, as you probably will have seen from the community post I did at the stage of this is being released a few weeks earlier. It takes a fair bit of funding to get there. So we are trying to offset some of that cost with our own little crowdfunding platform, link in the description below. And as you know, I don't usually mention things like, favorite subscribe. I find that a little annoying, or Patreon or stuff like that. But in this case, a little bit of help would be appreciated. And if you feel like doing so, it is down there. The schedule for the Australia trip should be up on the community post by now. So you can look through that. So if you happen to be one of our Antipodean listeners, you'll know when and where we are during that trip, so that you can come and say hi if you'd like. See you later, and I hope you don't get eaten by the Australian wildlife.